After all these years, you'd think I've seen every possible way a family can tear itself apart. But every so often, a story walks onto my stage that isn't just about yelling or cheating or a rebellious teen. It's about a quiet, insidious theft, not just the theft of money, but the theft of a mind, of a mother, of a family's trust. This was one of those times. This was the story of Carol. When my producers first briefed me on her case, the file read like 1,000 others. A 8-year-old widow, lonely, falls for a man online. He's handsome, successful, an engineer on an oil rig, of course, and he needs money for a series of escalating emergencies. The kids, a son and a daughter in their 30s, are frantic. They say she's drained her entire retirement savings, her late husband's life insurance, everything. The problem wasn't just the scam. That's a tragedy I see all too often. The problem was that Carol was the only person in her world who didn't believe she was being scammed. To her, this man, this David, was real. And her children, the two people she raised and loved, had become the enemy. They were the ones trying to sabotage her happiness. Before a guest ever sits in that chair across from me, I meet them. I want to look them in the eye without the lights, without the cameras, without the audience. I need to get a read on the person, not the persona they're about to put on. When I walked into the green room, the tension was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Her son, Mark, was pacing, his jaw tight. Her daughter, Sarah, sat on the edge of the sofa, wringing her hands, her eyes red-rimmed. They looked exhausted. They looked like they'd been to war. And then there was Carol. She was sitting in a chair in the corner, a universe away from her own children in a 10 by 10 room. She wasn't crying. She wasn't yelling. She had this look of defiant serenity. It's a look I know well. It's the armor of denial. It's a fortress built brick by brick to keep a painful reality at bay. She was a handsome woman, you could see that. She had kind eyes, but they were clouded over by this fierce, almost fanatical conviction. She carried a small, worn photograph of David, a picture of a silver-haired man with a warm smile, likely stolen from some real estate agent's website or a doctor's LinkedIn profile. She clutched it like a holy relic. When I introduced myself, she gave me a firm handshake. "Dr. Phil," she said, her voice steady, "I'm here to set the record straight. My children are trying to have me declared incompetent. They don't understand, they're just being selfish." Right there, that's the narrative she'd constructed. She wasn't a victim. She was a woman in love, being persecuted by her ungrateful children. In her story, she was the hero protecting her great love from a cynical world. And her kids, they were the villains. I could see the pain in Mark and Sarah's faces as she said it. It wasn't just about the money anymore. Their mother was looking right at them and seeing monsters. I sat down, not with her, but in the space between them. I looked at the kids. "What's the goal here today? What do you want to walk out of here with?" Mark stopped pacing. "I want my mom back," he said, his voice cracking. "I want the mom who was smart and strong, who taught us to be careful." This woman, I don't know who she is, that's the core of it right there. Identity theft. The scammer hadn't just stolen Carol's money, he had stolen her identity as a wise mother and replaced it with that of a fool, a dupe. And in her fight to reject that label, she was pushing away the very people who were trying to save her. I turned to Carol. I kept my voice calm, even. "Carol, I've heard what your kids have to say. I've read the emails. I've seen the bank statements. But I'm not here to talk to them right now. I'm here to talk to you. I want to understand. Tell me about David." And as she began to speak, her whole demeanor changed. The defensive armor softened. Her eyes lit up. She spoke of his poetry, the long emails he'd send in the middle of the night from the oil rig, the promises of a future together, traveling the world. She was describing a fantasy, a perfectly tailored, custom-designed fantasy for a lonely heart. And my job, the job I knew was going to be painful for everyone in that room, was to burn that fantasy to the ground so we could see what, if anything, was left standing in the rubble. Because the truth is, you can't build a new future on a foundation of lies. It will always collapse. And Carol's house was already falling down around her. She just couldn't see it yet. To understand a person's present, you have to excavate their past. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty and dig. Carol's story didn't start the day she met David online. It started the day she lost her husband, Tom. They had been married for 35 years. From what the kids told me, it wasn't a fairy tale romance, but it was real. It was a partnership. Tom was the quiet, steady one. He handled the finances. He fixed things around the house. He was her anchor. When he died suddenly from a heart attack 3 years prior, the anchor was gone and Carol was set adrift. The first year was a blur of grief, casseroles from neighbors, and learning to navigate a world built for two as a party of one. The kids did their best. Mark would come over and mow the lawn. Sarah would help with groceries and sit with her for hours. But they had their own lives, their own families. They couldn't fill the silence that descended on the house at 6 p.m. every evening when Tom used to walk through the door. Loneliness is a powerful, corrosive force. It eats away at your self-worth. It quiets your instincts. It makes you vulnerable. A lonely person isn't looking for a scam. They're looking for a connection. And the predators of this world, they can smell that kind of loneliness from 1,000 miles away through a computer screen. That's where David came in. It started innocently enough. A friend request on social media from a handsome man whose profile said he was also a widower. He said he was moved by a tribute she had posted to her late husband. Right there, that's step one in the playbook. Establish common ground. Create a sense of a shared tragic bond. He wasn't some young kid trying to flirt. He was a peer, a man who understood her pain. His first messages weren't romantic. They were empathetic. He asked about Tom. He shared stories of his own late wife. He listened. And for a woman who felt like she was a burden to her busy children, having someone's undivided attention was like water in the desert. He groomed her meticulously. He learned her schedule, her hopes, her fears. He started with emails, long, beautifully written letters that were almost certainly copy-pasted from a scammer's script. He painted a picture of his life on this remote oil rig, a lonely hero providing for his family, isolated from the world. It's a classic setup because it creates a perfect excuse for why he can never video chat, why his phone connection is always bad, and why he's in a different time zone. It builds a bubble around their communication, a secret world just for the two of them. And then came the love bombing. You're the most incredible woman I've ever known. I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for you. I tell the guys on the rig about my angel in America. It's an overwhelming, intoxicating flood of affection and affirmation. For Carol, who had gone from being a wife to a widow, a partner to a third wheel, this wasn't just flattering, it was life-affirming. It rebuilt the identity that grief had shattered. She wasn't just Tom's widow anymore. She was David's great love. I watched her on stage, under the lights, as she told me all this. Her kids sitting beside her were flinching with every word. They had heard it all before. They had tried to point out the inconsistencies. Mom, his photos are stock images. We found them online. Mom, his grammar is terrible for a supposed engineer from Texas. Mom, why won't he ever just FaceTime you for 2 minutes? But by that point, the psychological hooks were in too deep. Every argument from her children wasn't seen as an act of protection. It was reframed by David as an act of jealousy. He was a master manipulator. He'd tell her, they're just worried you'll have a new man in your life. They don't want to see you happy. They're afraid I'll take their inheritance. He was systematically isolating her, turning her against her own support system. It's the second step in the playbook. Isolate the target. Her brain was performing incredible mental gymnastics to protect the fantasy. This is called cognitive dissonance. The belief I am a smart, savvy woman was in direct conflict with the evidence I am being duped by an obvious scam. The easiest way to resolve that dissonance isn't to admit you're a fool, it's to discredit the evidence. So the stock photos, David explained that for security reasons, he couldn't use his real pictures online. The bad grammar, he said he was often typing quickly on his phone in a loud engine room. The lack of video calls, the rig had a strict no camera policy. For every logical red flag, he had an illogical, emotionally charged answer, and she bought every single one. Because the alternative that she had given her heart and was now giving her money to a complete fiction was simply too catastrophic to contemplate. The first request for money was small. A few $100s for a new satellite phone so they could talk more clearly. It was the test. She sent it without hesitation. The hook was set. The real damage was about to begin. Once she sent that first payment, the floodgates opened. It was a masterclass in psychological escalation. It never started with a demand for $100,000. It started with a plausible crisis. The satellite phone was just the beginning. A week later, there was a medical emergency on the rig. David needed to help a coworker pay for a flight to get urgent care. It was $5,000. He promised to pay her back with a bonus he was due to receive. Carol, seeing herself as a partner to this heroic, compassionate man, wired the money. She wasn't just sending cash, she was participating in his life, solving his problems. It made her feel needed, important. Then came the bigger hooks. The equipment on the rig supposedly broke down. He was personally liable for the repairs, and if he didn't pay, he'd lose his job and be stranded overseas. The amount was $25,000. This was the first time she had to dip into her retirement savings. I can picture her in the bank, her heart probably pounding. There's a part of your brain, that little voice of reason, that has to be screaming, "This is crazy!" But the emotional narrative David had built was stronger. He was her future. This wasn't losing money. It was an investment in their life together. He sent her fake legal documents, invoices with official-looking letterheads, all easily created on a home computer. But to her, they were proof. This is when the kids really started to panic. Mark saw the large withdrawal from the joint account they had set up after their dad passed. He confronted her. "Mom, what is this? Who is this, David?" The confrontation backfired spectacularly. Instead of making her pause, it made her dig in her heels. In her mind, Mark's suspicion wasn't concern. It was an attack on her judgment and an attack on the man she loved. David had prepped her for this. Your son might not understand. He's very protective, and he doesn't know me yet. He had turned her own son's love for her into a weapon against him. She became secretive, defensive. She opened new bank accounts that her children couldn't see. She was now living a double life. The crises became more and more dramatic. David was supposedly being detained by customs officials over a tax issue with his company. He needed $50,000 for legal fees to be released. If he didn't pay, he'd go to prison in a foreign country. The emotional stakes were now life and death. He'd call her, or rather text her frantically, claiming he was using a borrowed phone and only had minutes. The manufactured urgency is a key tactic. It prevents the victim from having time to think, to consult anyone, to let logic catch up with emotion. It creates a state of perpetual crisis where she is the only one who can save him. She liquidated a stock portfolio her husband had carefully built for their retirement. The money was gone in an instant, wired to an overseas account that was likely closed within hours. Sarah tried a different approach. She tried the soft, emotional appeal. Mom, we miss you. We're so worried about you. Dad wouldn't want this. She brought over articles about romance scams, showed her video clips from my own show about other women in the same situation. But Carol's mind had an antibody for every piece of evidence. She would say, "That's not David. Our love is different. Those other women were foolish, but I know him." The denial was absolute. To admit that she was just like those other women on television would be to admit the entire foundation of her last year had been a lie. The shame would be unbearable. So the wall went up higher. She accused Sarah of being jealous of her happiness. The argument was vicious. Sarah left in tears, and they didn't speak for a month. The family was imploding. The two people who loved her most were being systematically cut out of her life, replaced by a ghost on the internet. The final straw came when Carol took out a second mortgage on her home, the home she and Tom had paid off over 30 years. It was for $150,000. The story this time was that David had finally secured a massive contract, but he needed to buy special equipment to fulfill it. This was the big one. This was the payday that would allow him to finally leave the rig, come home to her, and pay her back everything tenfold. He sent her a doctored photo of a Wells Fargo account statement showing millions of dollars that would be released to him once the deal was complete. It was so obviously fake, it was laughable. But she wasn't looking at it with critical eyes. She was looking at it with the eyes of a true believer. When Mark and Sarah found out about the mortgage, they knew they had lost all control. They felt they had no choice left. They called my show. They weren't just trying to save the money anymore. They were trying to save their mother from a psychological prison she couldn't see the bars of. And when she agreed to come on, it wasn't to get help. It was, in her mind, to finally prove to the world and to her children that they were wrong and her love was real. The moment we went live, the air on the stage crackled. You could feel the years of frustration, fear, and betrayal coiled up in Mark and Sarah. And from Carol, there was this wall of serene, unshakable certainty. That's the most difficult kind of delusion to confront. It's not loud or hysterical. It's quiet and profound. I started by letting her tell her story uninterrupted. I wanted the audience, and more importantly, her, to hear it laid out in a linear fashion, from start to finish. I had her describe David, their future plans, the house they would buy. She spoke with a genuine, heartfelt passion. She wasn't a bad person. She wasn't a stupid person. She was a person who had been expertly manipulated at the lowest point in her life. Then I turned to the evidence. We put the picture of David up on the big screen. "Carol," I said, my voice calm and direct, "I need you to look at this man. This is the man you've given your heart and your life savings to." She nodded, a soft smile on her face. "That's my David." Then, right next to his picture, we put up another one. It was the same man in a different shirt, standing with a woman and two children. His name was Dr. Ahmet Yilmaz, a respected surgeon from Turkey. His family had contacted us. Scammers had stolen his photos years ago, and they had been used to defraud countless women around the world. Carol, I said gently, this man's name is not David. He's a doctor, he's a husband and a father. He has no idea who you are. This is the moment of confrontation. This is where the fantasy collides with brute force reality. Her reaction was instantaneous. No, that's not true. That's a fake picture you created. David told me people would try to do this. He warned me. Her brain was rejecting the truth. It was fighting for survival, the survival of the narrative she had built. The cognitive dissonance was so powerful, she was accusing me on national television of fabricating evidence to trick her. Mark and Sarah just sank in their chairs, the last glimmer of hope draining from their faces. I knew pushing harder on the photo wouldn't work. It was a head-on collision, and her defenses were too strong. I had to come at it from a different angle. I shifted from the who to the how. We brought out a financial expert. We put every single wire transfer she had made up on the screen. The dates, the amounts, the receiving banks in Nigeria, Malaysia, and the Philippines. $5,000 here, $25,000 there, $150,000 in one lump sum. The total came to over $400,000. I made her look at it. Carol, forget David for a second. Let's just talk about the money. This is the money your husband Tom worked his entire life for. This was your security. This was for your old age. It's gone. Where did it go? She started to falter. It was easier to defend a person than it was to defend a string of anonymous bank transfers. It went to David, she insisted, but her voice was a little weaker for his business. He's going to pay it all back. When, Carol? I pressed. He's been promising to come home for a year. First it was a customs issue, then a tax problem, then a frozen bank account. There's always a reason, isn't there? There's always one more problem that only your money can solve. Then I did something that my producers were nervous about. I had one of my investigators, a former FBI agent, on a satellite feed. He was in a call center in another country that we had managed to trace some of her money to. He walked through the building with a hidden camera. It was a boiler room. Dozens of young men sitting at computers, working from scripts, running multiple scams at once. They were laughing, joking, treating it like any other 9-to-5 job. Carol, I said, David isn't on an oil rig. He's probably in a room just like this one. He's not one person. He's a team of people who have been playing you for a year. You're not his great love. You're a target. You're a file on a computer. That's when the first crack appeared. I saw it in her eyes. The defiant armor started to chip. The thought that she wasn't even talking to one person, but to a committee of thieves. It was a profound violation. It depersonalized the fantasy. The specific image of David began to dissolve into a blurry, anonymous fraud. She started to shake her head, a silent no, no, no. But it was a denial born of horror, not conviction. Sarah reached over and took her hand. For the first time all day, Carol didn't pull away. I leaned forward. Carol, the hardest thing in the world is to admit you've been wrong, especially when it costs you everything, but the lie is killing you. The lie has destroyed your family. The lie is going to leave you with nothing. The truth is painful, but the truth is where you start to heal. The truth is David is not real. And then she finally broke. It wasn't a loud sob. It was a quiet, guttural sound of a heart shattering. The tears she had been holding back for a year finally came, and she collapsed into her daughter's arms. The fortress had crumbled. It was a devastating moment, but it was also the first moment of genuine hope, because now, finally, We had something real to work with. The fantasy was dead. The long, hard work of dealing with the reality could begin. The camera stopped rolling, but the real work was just starting. That raw, agonizing moment on stage wasn't a conclusion, it was an opening. It's one thing to shatter a delusion in the controlled environment of a television studio, but it's another thing entirely to help someone start picking up the pieces in the quiet reality of their own life. After the show, I sat with Carol and her children in the green room for a long time. The defiance was gone, replaced by a profound, hollowed-out shame. She couldn't even look at Mark and Sarah. She just stared at her hands, turning her wedding ring around and around, the last tangible piece of her old life. "I'm so stupid," she whispered. It's the first thing everyone in her position says. It's the shame talking. "No, Mom, you're not," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were grieving. You were lonely. They took advantage of that." She was right, of course. Scammers don't prey on stupidity. They prey on humanity. They prey on kindness, on trust, on loneliness, on the universal human need for connection. I told Carol that. I said, "This is not an intelligence test. These are professional manipulators. They run psychological warfare for a living. You were their target, not their partner in foolishness. There is a huge difference." We talked about the psychology of it all, about how they had groomed her, about the love bombing, the isolation, the manufactured crises. I needed her to understand the mechanics of the scam, not just the outcome. If she could see the playbook, she could stop blaming herself for falling for the plays. It was a process of externalizing the blame, moving it from her own character to the actions of the criminals. I was criminally targeted. This is a critical step. You can't heal from a wound you insist on reopening by blaming yourself every day. The financial reality was brutal. The money was gone. All of it. We had our forensic team do a trace, but as is almost always the case with these international scams, the money had been moved through so many cutouts and mule accounts that it was effectively vaporized. There would be no recovery. The second mortgage was real, and the payments were due. Carol was facing the loss of her home, the only significant asset she had left. This is the second wave of trauma for victims. After the emotional devastation comes the life-altering financial ruin. Mark and Sarah were in a tough spot. They were angry, yes, but seeing their mother so completely broken had tempered that anger with a deep, sorrowful pity. They had to figure out how to move forward. Mark, the pragmatist, was already thinking about finances. "We'll have to sell the house, Mom. There's no other way. You can come and live with us." Carol flinched. The idea of leaving her home, the one filled with memories of Tom, and becoming a dependent in her son's house was the ultimate symbol of her failure. It was another layer of loss, another piece of her identity being stripped away. I knew this was a critical juncture. The family could either rally and heal together, or the lingering resentment and shame could fester and drive them apart for good. I put them in touch with a therapist in their hometown who specialized in trauma and family counseling. I told them this wasn't a one-and-done conversation. This would require ongoing work, a commitment to rebuilding trust, and a space where Carol could process her grief and shame without judgment, and where Mark and Sarah could process their anger and feelings of betrayal. The outcome for Carol was never going to be a simple, happy ending. You don't just bounce back from losing your life savings and having your entire emotional world revealed as a fraud. The outcome I was hoping for was one of resilience, not recovery. Recovery implies you get back what you lost. That money was never coming back. Her innocence, her trust in the world was never going to be the same. Resilience, on the other hand, is about adapting to the new reality. It's about finding a way to stand up again after being knocked down, even if you're standing on different, less stable ground. In the weeks and months that followed, we kept in touch. The house was sold. It was a painful, tearful process of packing up 35 years of memories. Carol moved into a small apartment near Sarah. It was a difficult adjustment. There were days of profound depression where she wouldn't get out of bed, overwhelmed by what she had done. The shame was a constant companion. She'd see a happy couple walking down the street and be reminded of the future she thought she was going to have with David. She'd see a commercial for a retirement community and be hit with the full force of the financial security she had thrown away. But slowly, incrementally, things began to change. Her therapy sessions were helping. She started to talk about the hole that Tom's death had left in her life, a void so vast that she had been willing to fill it with anything, even a beautiful lie. For the first time, she was truly mourning her husband, not just the absence of a partner. She was also rebuilding her relationship with her children. It was tentative at first, but they made an effort. They had family dinners every Sunday. They didn't talk about the money. They talked about their week, about the grandkids, about memories of their dad. They were learning to be a family again, a different family, one scarred by this experience, but a family nonetheless. She started volunteering at a local animal shelter a few days a week. It gave her a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. It was a place where she could give love and receive it unconditionally without the risk of deception. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. The story of Carol doesn't end with her riding off into the sunset, financially secure and emotionally whole. That's not how real life works. The outcome for her was much more complex, much more grounded in the messy reality of what comes after a catastrophe. It was a story of survival and the slow, arduous process of redefining a life. She never got the money back. She never will. The David persona and the team of scammers behind it vanished like smoke, leaving behind a crater in her life and the lives of her children. But what did emerge from that crater was something real. The biggest change was in Carol herself. The woman who walked onto my stage, wrapped in a defiant fantasy, was gone. In her place was a quieter, more somber, but infinitely stronger person. She had been forced to look into the abyss of her own vulnerability and denial, and she hadn't turned away. She had confronted the ugliest truth about herself, that her loneliness had made her a willing participant in her own destruction, and she had survived it. There's a particular kind of wisdom that only comes from that kind of radical self-honesty. She lost her naivete, but she gained a profound, hard-won self-awareness. Her relationship with Mark and Sarah was forever changed. The old dynamic, the all-knowing mother and the dependent children, was shattered. In its place, a more honest, adult relationship began to grow. They saw her not as a fragile victim to be pitied, but as a survivor, and she, in turn, saw them not as persecutors who had tried to ruin her happiness, but as the only two people in the world who loved her enough to fight for her, even when she was fighting against them. The trust was being rebuilt, not on the old foundation, but on a new one, forged in the fire of shared crisis. It was a more sober, more realistic kind of love, but in many ways, it was deeper. About a year after the show, my producer got an email from Sarah. It was an update. Carol was still living in her apartment. She had made a few friends through her volunteer work at the shelter. She was managing her tight budget carefully, a skill she was learning for the first time in her life. She was taking control of the things she could control. But the most significant part of the email was about something Carol had started doing. She had joined an online support group for victims of romance scams. At first, she just listened, or rather read the stories of others, seeing her own pain reflected back at her. It made her feel less alone, less uniquely foolish. Then, one day, she wrote a post. She shared her story. She didn't hold back. She wrote about the loneliness, the flattery, the way her own mind had tricked her, the red flags she had ignored, the confrontation on my show, and the shame that followed. And the response was overwhelming. Dozens of other women and some men replied saying, "That was my story too. Thank you for being so brave. You've described exactly how I felt." In that moment, Carol found a new purpose. The shame that had kept her silent for so long was transformed into a tool for connection and healing. She became an active voice in that community, not as a professional or an expert, but as a fellow survivor. She learned to spot the scammer scripts, to identify the manipulative language, to warn others about the latest tactics. She couldn't get her money back, but she could help prevent someone else from losing theirs. She couldn't erase her own pain, but she could use her experience to ease the pain of others. She had taken the worst experience of her life and found a way to wring some meaning from it. That, to me, is the real outcome. It's not about retribution or financial recovery. It's about the reclamation of self. Carol lost everything she thought defined her: her financial security, her home, her identity as a savvy matriarch. But in the rubble, she found something else, a core of resilience she never knew she had, a deeper relationship with her children, and a new mission born from her own suffering. She is a cautionary tale, yes, but she is not a tragedy. She is a survivor who learned to navigate the world with her eyes wide open, who carries her scars not as a mark of shame, but as a map that can help guide others through the same dark territory. Her story is a testament to the fact that even when you lose everything, you can still find a way to build something new, something real, something that matters. And in the end, that's a kind of victory that no scammer can ever take away.